What if history's most powerful religion was built on buried secrets and radical acts of kindness, not conquest? Someone decided what you'd never read. Someone rewrote the story. The truth behind Christianity.
What is the truth about the global journey of Christianity? How did a tiny, persecuted sect from the fringes of the ancient world rise to become the largest religious institution in human history?
It is a story that defies every conventional rule of empire building. It didn't start with conquering armies, wealthy elites, or royal decrees, but rather in the dusty, heavily oppressed margins of the ancient Mediterranean.
How did this massive global movement actually begin? Before it had cathedrals, popes, or political power. It sparked in the 1st century, within the economic and political Powder Keg of Judea. The region was a restless, volatile province under the iron grip of the Roman Empire, filled with apocalyptic prophets and desperate citizens. Why were the people of Judea so incredibly desperate, waiting for a savior to rescue them from their daily lives?
In the year 6 CE, the Roman prefect Quirinius instituted a sweeping census that triggered widespread unrest. Judeans suddenly faced a crushing dual tax burden: ruthless Roman land taxes collected by corrupt officials, piled on top of mandatory Jewish temple taxes.
How did the local population react to this crushing Roman oppression and endless taxation? Second Temple Judaism splintered. While some elites collaborated with Rome, militant groups known as the Zealots began preparing for a bloody holy war. They were waiting for a warrior Messiah who would violently overthrow their Roman overlords. When the Romans inevitably cracked down on these uprisings, why didn't the early Jesus movement get wiped out along with the violent rebels? Because it executed a brilliant tactical pivot. The famous phrase, "Render to Caesar what is Caesar's," wasn't just a spiritual lesson. It was a masterful strategy to decouple the movement from political insurrection and avoid immediate Roman execution. How did this peaceful sect survive when the simmering tensions finally exploded and Rome annihilated Jerusalem? In 70 CE, the Jewish-Roman War resulted in the catastrophic destruction of the Second Temple. While militant sects were entirely wiped out, the Jesus movement survived by subverting messianic expectations and pivoting entirely to a spiritual rather than earthly kingdom. Without a central temple or a holy city to gather in, how did this scattered underground movement manage to spread its message? It turned to a revolutionary form of ancient networking: the written letter. Decades before the stories of Jesus were formalized into books, a former persecutor named Paul began writing epistles. These letters served as strategic, adaptable blueprints for building decentralized communities. Were the famous Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the very first Christian texts to be written down?
Surprisingly, no. The Pauline epistles, penned between 50 and 60 AD, are the earliest Christian texts in existence. They predated the written Gospels by decades, meaning the theology and organizational structure of the church were established before the narrative of Jesus' life was officially recorded.
With dozens of letters and stories circulating across the empire, how did the early church decide which of these texts were actually official?
They were largely forced into it by a 2nd century heretic named Marcion of Sinope. In 140 AD, Marcion proposed a radical canon that entirely rejected the Hebrew Bible. To combat this, Orthodox leaders scrambled to define a strict official list of acceptable scriptures.
What happened to the other Gospels and writings that didn't make the official cut? Famous lost texts like the Gospel of Judas weren't accidentally forgotten or misplaced by history. They were deliberately banned. The early church applied strict theological filters, systematically erasing writings that featured mystical, contradictory, or politically inconvenient portrayals of the divine. Armed with a unified message and a growing network, how did the mighty Roman Empire react to this underground sect? Rome viewed them as a dangerous, treasonous cult because they refused to participate in the imperial cult of emperor worship. Christians were subjected to brutal, state-sponsored persecutions, forced into the shadows, and routinely executed in public arenas to entertain the masses. How fast was Christianity actually growing while it was still an illegal, hunted movement living in the shadows? It grew at a staggering, almost mathematically impossible rate of roughly 40% per decade. By the time it was finally legalized in 313 CE by Emperor Constantine,
This persecuted, underground sect had amassed an estimated 6 million fiercely loyal followers across the empire.
If it wasn't military conquest or political power, what was the secret catalyst that fueled this impossible, explosive growth?
The catalyst wasn't just charismatic preaching. It was apocalyptic disease. During the devastating Antonine Plague in 165 CE and the Plague of Cyprian in 251 CE, Roman society completely collapsed. Up to 5,000 people were dying every single day in the capital alone.
How did early Christians respond to these apocalyptic plagues differently than the rest of the Roman Empire? While wealthy Romans, politicians, and even pagan physicians fled the infected cities to save themselves, the Christians stayed behind. They organized a grassroots social safety net, risking their own lives to provide basic nursing, food, and water to the sick, regardless of their religion.
What was the ultimate result of this radical, life-threatening compassion in the midst of a deadly pandemic? Christianity didn't conquer the Roman Empire with swords. It won the empire by nursing the sick. Their basic care drastically reduced mortality rates in their communities, and the survivors they nursed back to health overwhelmingly converted to the faith, fundamentally shifting the empire's demographics.
Once it conquered the empire from within, how did a victorious Christianity fundamentally change the worldview of the Roman world?
It completely rewired the Western mind's concept of time. The ancient pagan world viewed history as an endless, repeating cycle of seasons and empires. Christianity replaced this with a linear timeline, a distinct beginning at Genesis, moving relentlessly forward toward an ultimate, purposeful conclusion.
For centuries after the fall of Rome, how did the institutional church maintain control over this linear march of progress?
For over a millennium, the church maintained a strict monopoly on knowledge. By keeping the Bible exclusively in Latin and controlling the education of the elite, the institutional hierarchy ensured that ordinary believers had to rely entirely on the priesthood for spiritual and intellectual guidance.
What revolutionary event finally shattered the church's 1,000-year monopoly on knowledge and power?
The invention of the mechanical printing press in the 15th century. Reformers like Martin Luther weaponized this emerging technology, translating the Bible into everyday languages and mass-producing pamphlets. For the first time, ordinary people could read the scriptures and question religious authority for themselves.
Did the printing press and the violent schisms that followed ultimately destroy the Christian faith?
Far from destroying it, the fracturing of the church actually propelled it into a new era of aggressive global expansion. Competing Catholic and Protestant factions launched massive missionary campaigns alongside European colonization, spreading their specific brands of the faith to the Americas, Asia, and Africa.
After 2,000 years of expansion, where is the true demographic center of this globe-spanning institution today?
It is no longer a Western religion. In 1910, roughly 66% of the global Christian population lived in Europe. Today, the demographic center of gravity has shifted dramatically. The faith is exploding across the global south, completely redefining what a typical Christian looks like.
Looking back at the plagues, the politics, and the printing press, what is the ultimate truth about Christianity's rise and its global future?
The most surprising truth about Christianity's rise is that it did not conquer the Roman Empire by the sword, but rather through a radical, grassroots social safety net, growing at an astonishing 40% per decade as early Christians stayed behind to nurse the sick during devastating Roman plagues. From its origins in the economic and political powder keg of first-century Judea, the Jesus movement survived by decoupling itself from violent rebellion, eventually transforming from an underground, persecuted sect into a globe-spanning institution. Along the way, it survived massive theological schisms, weaponized emerging technologies like the printing press, and fundamentally rewired the Western mind by replacing the ancient concept of cyclical time with a linear march toward progress. Today, the faith has returned to its grassroots origins, with its demographic center of gravity shifting dramatically away from the West and into the global South.
As the demographic center of gravity moves southward, what does this dramatic shift mean for the future of the faith?
By 2050, nearly 40% of the world's 2.4 billion Christians will live in sub-Saharan Africa. The religion has come full circle.
moving away from the halls of Western institutional power and returning to the dynamic, grassroots, community-driven survivalism that first allowed it to conquer the ancient world.
We started by asking, the global journey of Christianity. And the answer? The most surprising truth about Christianity's rise is that it did not conquer the Roman Empire by the sword, but rather through a radical, grassroots social safety net, growing at an astonishing 40% per decade, as early Christians stayed behind to nurse the sick during devastating Roman plagues. From its origins in the economic and political powder keg of first-century Judea, the Jesus movement survived by decoupling itself from violent rebellion, eventually transforming from an underground, persecuted sect into a globe-spanning institution. If this changed how you see things, share it with someone who needs to hear it.